Hello, friends. Welcome to today's episode. I'm so excited for you to meet Annie. Annie Wright is somebody that I had a wonderful fortune of meeting back in February 2020. Yes, the before times. And today I'm just so excited that you get a chance to meet her. She gives you an incredible introduction of kind of her LinkedIn bio and her life bio, but I'm going to do a quick one up front too. So, Annie Wright is a licensed psychotherapist and EMDR certified clinician, a relational trauma recovery specialist, and she is the founder and owner of Evergreen Consulting, a boutique trauma informed 18 clinician therapy center in Berkeley, California. It's so cool because when we last saw each other, it was so beautiful to be able to bear witness to some really big milestones in her business. And it has just grown ever since. And to have that story of during COVID is just like extra amazing personally for me to be able to bear witness to from the other side of the country, and to be able to have her on today to talk about some of the things I nerd out about. If you are somebody that knows me personally, you probably know I'll talk about therapy and any element of how we as human beings can understand who we are, where we came from, and if we have trauma in our background, how we might be able to take that trauma and adapt in some way to be able to be operating from our strengths. And so Annie brings so much incredible wisdom in today's episode. We talk about so many different things, mainly how we as human beings adapt to what it is to be humans that come in this world as children that are impacted by the people, the places, and the environments around us. And as we continue to grow into our adulthood, how those patterns as children may impact how we handle that really amazing experience of adulting, and what it looks like for us to acknowledge that, especially if you are part of any generation that is normalizing, leaning into, and celebrating the need for our mental health to be paramount, a priority in our way of interacting with ourselves, with others, and how we build a society that's more kind of healing focused than destruction focused. I think this episode will be right up your alley. So, without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce you to my friend Annie. Annie, welcome to Checkbox Other. I am so excited that you're here today.
Oh, it's an honor, Nikki. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'm already dancing. I need to control myself.
Oh,
So, as I mentioned, we love to start this by passing the microphone to you for you to give what I like to call your Cliff Notes version of your journey, the twists, the turns, the aha moments that led you, Annie, to who you are, where you are, and the amazing stuff you're doing in the world today.
oh, thank you so much. I feel so honored. Well, the LinkedIn bio title is this: I'm a relational trauma recovery specialist. I'm a trauma clinician, EMDR certified clinician. I'm a therapy center founder. My therapy center is located here in Berkeley, California. I'm an online course creator and a mental health writer. So
Ooh.
that's what it says on the LinkedIn bio. But what's important to know is that I'm sort of that penultimate example of the archetype of the wounded healer. Every little bit of my work in the world, whether it's through my own clinical work that I do with my clients, through the work that we do at the center, my online course, et cetera, it's designed to help people who had early adverse childhood experiences have better adulthoods, because that's my story. I come from a pretty significant childhood trauma neglect background, although I didn't know to call it that at the time. And it was only through the course of my own somewhat deliberate and somewhat fortuitous healing journey in my 20s and into my 30s that I came to know what it was I was actually dealing with. And then discovered, hey, this is actually what I want to do with my life, and be able to turn around and give this kind of work to others, so that hopefully folks like I had bad childhoods, we have wonderful adulthoods, but also so we stop the sort of cycle of abuse that can sometimes be perpetuated when you have unresolved trauma symptoms. So it's a little bit more about who I am and why I'm so passionate about this work.
I love that. I mean, it's one of those things just so you all know, this happens sometimes. I'm so excited to see someone. First of all, Annie and I, the last time we saw each other was February 2020. So we're really excited to see so nerded out about this conversation before we started this conversation. And so you're like, oh, hold on, I want to talk about all this live.
Yeah.
Um, your work, what you do, and how you occupy space in this in this work, I think is so incredibly needed. Um, and I think there is a special sauce when it is about like, hey, yo, I learned this because I needed it, but also I can't not spread it to the world to know and learn and heal together. So it really is that like, let's get that tide to rise all to lift all the boats. I just think that's so freaking powerful.
Mm, thank you.
So feel like you touched on this. Sometimes this happens in the bio, right? You touch a little bit on what that like other story might be, but maybe there are others. And so I open the floor for you to share a time in your life where you have felt other, different, or as though you didn't belong, and how that has kind of impacted how you know, go through each and every day.
Totally. I'm like one story trying Um, so the way that I felt most othered in my life is through being what I would kind of view myself as the black sheep of my family. I was the one who maybe pushed back against the abuse really early on. I was, the fighter saying, no, this isn't right. I was the one who started speaking out about it and who sort of exposed the skeletons in the closet, as it were, and who demanded something a little bit different in terms of healthy communication, healthy relationship patterns, etc. So my experience of feeling othered has been really dominant my entire life, growing up in the family system that I did, and the very cool thing about then turning around and carving out this space in the psychotherapy world is I don't feel other in my clinical work, and I don't feel other when I'm surrounded by members of my community who had similar experiences. But because of my extreme sense of feeling other and alone, and at times really crazy, like, am I crazy for having this experience and thinking and feeling this way? Choosing to write about it and to create courses around it and to create an entire body of clinical work around it is actually what profoundly healed my sense of otherness, because I discovered, oh, no, I'm not crazy. And in fact, there are many people who can relate to this experience as well.
I love that. It's fascinating because I think that as we, especially that this is what we were talking about a little bit before, these invisible others from the out to the outside world, these
Mhm.
experiences that we have that we know very much that are happening, but you might not be able to see if you're looking at me, are
Sure.
things that can be so dizzying and be so like, wait, is this real? Or like, is this made up? Am I living in an alternate universe? Am I not mapping the information correctly?
Right.
Because if the outside world is, if this is as wrong as it feels to me, and the outside world isn't responding to it, and this inside world is for sure not responding to it, how am I the only person seeing it? And how powerful it is to be willing to kind of raise a hand, reach out and say, okay, I might be off here, but like I'm gonna throw it out and see what happens. That I
Right.
feel like when you were talking about, it felt like there was like this cone of silence oftentimes as somebody that grew up in an abusive household as well. And
Mm.
it wasn't physical, right? So the kind of very hidden part of it, silence is such an oppressive element to that too. So being able to and willing to share is something that I think is so incredibly powerful in breaking some of that cycle.
It can be, it absolutely can be. And the thing is, we also have to talk about it in the context of it can also have costs, right? There are
Yeah.
relationships I have lost, right? Plenty of relationships I've lost. There is a false sense of belonging I've lost.
Mm,
But I wouldn't trade any of that for the sense of feeling secure in myself and in my story and my experience.
yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things that I think is so important about and why I really wanted you to come on here today was to talk about the fact that, like, I think so many of us live in this world and try to do the best we can, right? That's at least my way of looking at the world. Even when people do horrible things, my belief is they're trying the best they can. Unfortunately, that thing was horrible, and that wasn't the way we really need to go and minimizing harm. But
Right.
I think one of the things that we've experienced in the last few years is that we're all collectively going through something very horrible that we're all experiencing at the same time, but not experiencing the same way. And a lot of that coming from kind of those foundations that we come from, those experiences that we came from, those formative dynamics we've had with our parental figures or our siblings or those kind of family systems we're within. Can you talk a little bit about, as somebody that's, in the room with people navigating this stuff real time, how these shifts in our society are really bubbling these very pressing issues up?
Oh, it's a great and it's a really big question. The first thing I just want to acknowledge is I feel like we have all been running at a sprint pace across a marathon basically since 2016. I mean, we rolled through that into a pandemic, into climate crisis, into civil political upheaval, unrest, exposing social justice wounds in the country more so than we ever have before. I mean, it has been a lot. And the thing is too, um, when we are in the crisis and we are presented with the threat immediately, right? Our bodies respond with, a cocktail of hormones that floods our system and helps us get through the moment. But what happens after the immediate threat passes, right? But there are still hardships at play. I think many, many people that I see are experiencing a level of collective burnout, the likes of which I never saw before in my prior years as a therapist. I've been a therapist for about 13 years now, if we count my training time. And so I have to say, I don't think people are doing all that well, to be honest. Even the most well resourced, the most internally and externally resourced people I know, there's a general baseline of struggle right now. And I don't think we talk about that enough, to the point where one thing going wrong in our work life or in our home life can set people into acute anxiety or a depressive episode. So, if you really want my opinion, I don't think we're doing all that well as a collective right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that exactly what you're saying about it's not just 3 years, right? It's compounded on top of itself, that it was like we were already struggling. And then it was like, let me just throw this once in a generation thing in here. And you guys handled
Exactly.
it. Just move over to Zoom. It'll be fine.
Oh, yeah, exactly, exactly. And of course, like we can talk about the pandemic, but there's so much else too, right? There's slow session recession. There is racial violence and catastrophe in the country. And there's also, I mean, and this is a thing like I want to name because I think we've become immune to it, a mass shooting of our children nearly every week, right? So I think I name all these things and I want to keep that conversation alive because I think a lot of people are thinking, what is wrong with me? Either why did I make a bad sloppy choice and do some damage there? Why am I drinking so much at night? Why can't I handle this more? Why am I just thinking about quitting my life and moving into the woods? It's
Yeah.
because we've been dealing with a lot for a very long time.
Yeah. And pair that with a desensitization, right? I think that the part which I love so much, you're like, well, let's talk about these things out loud. That
Yeah.
oftentimes, if it's on the news, which is again, if we're all got shoved into the same place consuming, yeah, there's probably a couple different places you can get information and they might be very different, but consuming still through pretty narrow lenses of overwhelming, inundating messaging, even if it's, and there are terrible things happening, but even things that aren't terrible are given to you in breaking news style, how much it just exhausts your system and desensitizes you to the things that we should be reacting to as, okay,
Correct.
my hair is on fire, but I felt like my hair was on fire about my detergent decision yesterday. It's a very different thing?
Correct, correct. And again, and then to nuance the conversation even more, all this is happening to, multiple groups of people. Let's say those with normative psychology backgrounds, like relatively functional, stable childhood histories. And then there's developmental trauma, complex trauma, relational trauma histories, right? So, what do these constant stressors and these threats of power and these pervasive lack of safety, what does that do to somebody whose psychological foundation maybe feels like a building built on quicksand, right? And so that's more of my clinical wheelhouse, is working with folks in that camp. And I do have to say, a lot of what's going on, that sort of perpetual um, lack of safety, perpetual threat, hypervigilance to elements in our society, that is a very known experience for people who come from relational trauma backgrounds. And it's also a very retriggering experience as well.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was just talking with a friend of mine about the fact that there were so many people. I think the collective conversation was, oh my God, how are we going to handle this change? And there were a lot of us that have created or shaken our lives up because it either needed to be to find a semblance of safety, or abandoned, kind of been excommunicated from a reality we thought we had. And so there was the kind of the beginning part of like, oh, I've kind of created, I've had to redefine, I've had to adjust, I've had to have a before and an after point of how I saw the world. I
Mhm.
know how to do that. I may not know how to do it exactly this way, but I have some
Yeah.
resilience built up in having to do some version of this in my life before. And it's really fascinating. I think a lot of people who have been through trauma, grief, loss, there was a familiarity and
Oh,
is a
yeah.
familiarity of these muscles.
Oh,
But
yeah.
that doesn't mean, right? I think the part that was so fascinating is it just hits you at a different place in a different way. It still can re-trigger. It's still exhausting. It's still using things that you aren't necessarily using every day to then still be expected to go out and live your daily life normally. How challenging it is when the narrative was that kind of normative lens of, oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. How are we going to do this? And there are a lot of people that like, there's been a lot of worse things that have happened,
Yeah.
and still this is terrible. And so creating space for those different timelines, those different experiences, and then the whole isolation of it all, because like
Oh,
we solitary confined as punishment, and that tended to be, whether it was solitary confinement or confined with a very specific group of people for an unknown amount of time, how that also messes with our psyche and our ability to deal with our own stuff and our interpersonal dynamics. How do you see, like, again, the generational element of all this as we are interacting with past, current, and future selves, but also all the different people in our lives that we're worried about and caring about?
are we talking about the pandemic now? Are we talking about the recession? Are we talking about like the state of, lack of safety, all of it?
Yes. I was talking, I feel like from a perspective of the collective experience that we all kind of had to shelter in place in
Yeah.
a way that this is where kind of the difference of communication of, oh my God, this is so hard for everybody,
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
was kind of COVID, pandemic, quarantine.
You know, I I don't think it was easy for anyone. I think it was hard in different ways for every single population group. And there were some elements of ease for every single population group. And I'll share more about what I mean. When the pandemic hit, I had a 14-month-old, and my husband and I are, we were both essential workers at the time. And, I was just 1 year into running my therapy center, like a year and change into being a parent. It was really hard in the sense of, obviously, like, you can't, when you have a kid, you can't just like lay in bed all day and like just watch reruns. You have to parent. But at the same time, that sort of forced contact to like go out on walks with her and play. And, actually having warm bodies in the house was a sort of, it was a bit of an emotional vaccine, as it were, to that time for me. And at the same time, I know plenty of people who were single in their late 20s or early 30s, didn't have the responsibilities of parenting or running their business, but they had no roommates, they had no significant other, they were by themselves. And actually, what I saw was the isolation took a more substantial toll on them, despite the lack of their responsibilities
Yeah.
relative.
Yeah.
So, and then I think about population groups whose developmental tasks during that time were literally to go out and socialize and connect and form bonds with peers. Like teenagers, I think teenagers had it some, roughest of all, to be quite frank. And I think also kids who were at that transitional age youth stage of 18 moving into college and having that experience really truncated for a couple years, that was really hard for many reasons. So I haven't quite found a population group that had an easy time. But maybe folks were like 57, kids are grown, like the compound interest has kicked in,
Yeah.
they've got themselves in this like lovely little house. I don't know. I didn't necessarily work with those individuals.
Yeah.
I think the pandemic took a lot of toll on every single population group I know.
Yeah. And it's, the other thing I love that you mentioned, um, the kind of the pockets of formative years, right? And that's the part where it's like, I mean, even at 57, there's some formative stuff that's happening in who your sense of self is moving forward, right? But I think we do focus on like prefrontal, like how's your brain processed? How are you able to interact with people? Do you like, especially younger kids, like the power of understanding facial expression below a mask, that you're not having that exposure to another person's communication with
Totally.
that kind of baseline stuff. How do you adapt in the evolutionary
Oh,
way?
yeah.
As human animals can actually adjust. Really fascinating when you have human beings that don't necessarily have the shared experience of, this is how at 5 years old, this is how I was exposed. This is the 5-step process for how you get into school and what you learn at school. And here's, you go for this amount of time. And again, none of that is really formulaically exact, but how powerful that is. And then, I was on when you're talking about teenagers going to college, I was on a trip back to the city a month or two ago, and I was sitting next to someone, and of course, I'm a chatty person, surprise. So I just turned to her and I'm like, "Hey, what's your story?" And she was a freshman in college and had moved across country, and so I was like, of course, I have a million questions, but I was just like, what was the big one? What is it like to be you? Right? Like, what was high school like that? What was it like to say, hey, I'm going to go across the country to go to school? And the whole idea of like, find yourself in college, like, what has that experience been?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And it's such a classic teenager answer that I would have given. She's like, well, it's all I know. So I'm just doing it. I was like, oh, that, forgot about that part. Because
Oh,
I am grieving the loss of something I had, but you didn't
yeah.
have it. So you're building based on whatever you have. You're not feeling that loss. Aside from maybe like news or like movies and TV and all that, you're
Yeah.
able to build. And so it was just really, again, that kind of resilience and my assumption based on her reality. I'm like, oh, wait, I
Oh,
don't know what I don't know. Okay.
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I think about my daughter and how quickly she learned that masks were just normal, right? Like this is just how it is, to the point where we took down some old picture books that had groups of people in them, probably in 2021 or something, and started reading them to her.
Yeah.
She was like, where are the masks? Like she was
What are
shocked.
these people doing? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But it was actually I really appreciate what you said. It's like kids learning subtle social emotional cues that come from smiles. That was actually something we saw in real time with my daughter and her cohort of little kiddos during those daycare years. They would ask more questions. Is she mad? Is she sad? Because they could only see eyes, they couldn't see facial expressions, and that is such a big part of how they learn other people's emotions and how to read a room and how to like relate. So that was interesting. There's probably some collective delays in that little cohort. um yeah.
But
So
also the curiosity. I mean, it's a part of me that's like, as we were saying before we hopped on, that like you start recognizing things of other people. So I hear that in a kid, and I'm like, oh my God, I wish I was given permission to ask how someone was feeling and not assumed that I just knew it. And so that skill
oh,
of being able to be like, hey, so what's up? I'm not really sure. Can I ask you? Or, okay, you're smiling. That must mean this. Like just the
really
kind of
great.
like when one sense is dulled, another one is heightened, how powerful it is to think about how your kids, your daughter and her team are like, hold on, we don't know the answer, but we know how to figure it out.
Correct, correct. It also speaks to a certain amount of implicit safety in their environment where they could check in with the grown-ups and ask, like, are you mad? Are you sad? Are you happy? Right? Like, not every kid in every environment gets to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, my brain's going in a million places.
I love it. It's such a rich conversation already.
I know. One of the things that I feel like I want to make sure we create some time to talk about is this experience of us kind of finding and refinding and redefining ourselves as we've had. I will join you in 2016 as that starting point, as we've had this kind of, okay, is this the world I thought I lived in? Is this how I want to contribute to the world? Is this the identity I want to occupy and the way I want to spend my time and energy? Of just our society having a whole lot of out loud questions that oftentimes you never hear at all, or you're having in like I always call them like whisper issues, like maybe with yourself if you say it out loud and maybe with a couple of trusted friends. But we've had these experiences in life of like, who am I? What do I believe? How do I want to interact with the world? Can you talk a little bit about as people are, I mean, I'll tell you this, I came to therapy and had a lot of those conversations.
Yeah.
Um, as you're holding space for people to be able to kind of navigate their individual kind of foundation and value set, as there's so many moving pieces and the foundation around us in our society is shifting and crumbling and changing, how do you kind of how have you seen the kind of impact? One of the things I sent you ahead of time was kind of this idea of the mother and the father wound and how we see ourselves relative to the people that have brought us into this world, whether it is mother, father, the dynamics of masculine, feminine, our relationships with others. How, as people are in that spot of like, how do I want to operate tomorrow and moving forward for myself? Has that danced with what did I learn from previous generations and the patterning that has brought me here?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the the patterns that we internalized from our early caregivers, whether was mom and a dad, non-binary, any constellation whatsoever, we form in relationship to our earliest relationships. And unless we practice a high degree of consciousness and deliberateness around exploring and shifting those patterns, we repeat those patterns. So as we move through the world, that is sort of the default operating system that we bring with us and we lead with. So what do I mean by this? If a woman was raised with a mother who coped with her own anxiety through workaholism, right? And she lost her job, with one of the 100,000 tech workers back on the market in the last 5 or so months. If she lost her job, she might be right now, instead of breathing, relaxing, like trying to calm her nervous system and looking at the data, being fine financially, she might be feeling like a five-alarm fire inside her body, right? She might be working 12 hours a day to network and get her name out there. She might not feel like she has an option to do anything different, right? And so whether we want to call that the mother wound or the father wound, etc., it's one of the early templates she had of responding to anxiety that she could have picked up from many of her caregivers. So what I see a lot of, and what I attempt to work with my clients on, especially with EMDR therapy, is finding out what patterns do we have within us that are functional, and what patterns do we have that are dysfunctional, no longer serving us, right? Maybe they helped us cope with really hard times growing up, but are no longer serving us. And in fact, they might be harming us. Then we rewire neural pathways to create more functional, adaptive choices, thoughts, and feelings so that we can consciously choose something different.
Uh,
That is like the ultimate reparenting work.
yeah. First of all, okay. One of the things you just said that it sounded, I mean, it was very normal, easy, everyday word kind of thing, but just like was the way that you talked about the word dysfunctional,
Oh, yeah.
that rids it of shame, taboo, weight.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
oftentimes when the word dysfunctional is used, it means there's something to feel badly about, or that you failed or you did something wrong. And really, I love how you said it's no longer working for what you need. Like it's
Oh,
not about are you good or bad. There's no value of your existence. It's
well, if I
something.
could just if I could just jump in, because I actually experienced you saying this earlier in the conversation. You said you have a worldview that people are generally doing their best. It's just that sometimes their best doesn't look, quite so good, does it? Right. I have a worldview that all all of the actions we take, even the ones that look really bad, right? Lying, cheating, stealing, eating disorders, substance use, abuse, screaming at our partners, manipulating our kids, at some level, all of these behaviors were ultimately designed to soothe us in some way, right? To protect us, to keep us safe. It's just that they might have worked at a certain point and then they stop working quite so well, or there's damage when we do them, right? And so I really operate from that strengths-based worldview that you have as well, Nikki, that I think people are doing their best within the limited scope of choices that they feel like they have. My job is just to try and help them get more choices.
Yes, it's so funny. My brain went, we're only given two doors, and there's so many doors. But if you only think you have two, you're going to choose the least harmful to you, or this, whatever is your priority of well-being. You're going to choose that. But maybe there are a million doors. Maybe there's infinite doors. But if you're not even given permission or safety to even look up past two,
Mm.
that's see, we started, I was all warm and excited to see you. Now I got chills all over my body. Come on now. Uh, oh man. So okay, this is one of my favorites. So I love talking to I love talking to therapists in general, because again, I could talk about this stuff all day. I am so curious to hear your take on how our perspective on therapy, mental health support has evolved generationally. So I like to talk about, the millennial generation being the therapy generation. It was like a Wall Street Journal or, Washington Post article that labeled millennials as that. And we have, generations prior that may have created space for their kids to talk, but didn't have that themselves. And the silent generation is a whole dynamic. And
Yeah.
then you have younger generations that are, which I think it's fascinating to watch, that there is the mental health conversation is loud, proud on TikTok,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is educated through casual conversation. And so I'd love to hear kind of your take on, especially in the last few years of it being like, oh, I learned this on TikTok from a fellow, whether or
Oh,
not they actually gone to school for these things. That's how I learned these things. Can you talk a little bit about how that, um, I guess, generational shift of understanding aptitude, comfort around conversation of this, and just how technology, I guess, has played a part in that too?
yeah, yeah. It's such an incredible conversation. Because there is, I mean, I have certainly seen like a glacial melting as the generations kind of
Right.
like pass down. Um, and I'm going to speak American centric right now because I think there are many cultures and countries in the world where it's still anathema to talk about mental health. But at least here in America, I think the way you traced it was very accurate. Um, it was like full non-starter with baby boomers, Gen X potentially a little bit, millennials. Yes, we definitely widened the conversation. I actually look at Gen Z and I think like they are trumpeting their own mental health diagnoses and wearing it like as proudly as one would wear like a skin color or a piece of clothing. Do you know what I mean? So I can't even imagine what's going to happen with my daughter's generation. Um, Concurrent with Gen Z's amplification of sort of mental health issues, of course, they are also the generation that literally grew up with screens, right? Like at the same time, they are the generation too that lived through the pandemic. And I think what happened alongside the pandemic is the amplification of mental health as a key cornerstone issue in society, in American society. So what we have is a generation who is very willing and liberal to talk about their mental health, with access to lots of online platforms to do so. And I think there are pros and cons to that. And some of the pros are normalization and destigmatization of mental health. Part of the con I do see is the very quick dissemination of what I would say is clinically inaccurate information. And I'm still forming an opinion around this, to be honest, because is it better if the word narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder is on everyone's lips versus not being on their lips? Yeah, maybe. And also, right, like there is a discrete set of diagnostic criterion, right, symptomology that we look for to diagnose that. And when people use that term really liberally to describe people in their lives, that can be well, it can be a little bit reckless, right, to self and to other. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, if you're asking me. But am I glad that there's more conversation about mental health? Of course I am. And I hope we move towards, a trend of reporting clinically accurate information. And in fact, clinical leaders taking more of a stand on those platforms to disseminate really sound information versus pop culture psychology.
Yeah, and it's, I love what I'm hearing as you're saying this is a bit of that pendulum swing idea, right? Like if we want people to, right, things are going to go to an extreme and we understand that they're going to have to kind of regulate and equalize for us to be able to actually effectively interact with each other. And I also I love the idea. I mean, a lot of this feels like, this is why I like talking about generational stuff oftentimes, is evolution.
Yeah.
That okay, this word meant this thing, and it was only through these people's lips that it usually came out with these 3 bullet points that would be, this is how you handle it next. And now people are talking about it. Okay, cool. How do we effectively understand that this is a reality we're working with and still allow for us to be able to move forward in a productive way that's not harming one another, and understanding that there is that ability for this word, like all words, to evolve and shift and change while also being able to effectively solve for the reason that there was a need for this to be clinically diagnosable. Like that there is, both things can be true.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I appreciate that nuancing of the conversation.
Yeah. One of the things, so I nerded out on your blogs. So for all of you, there will be a link to her blogs on in the show notes. Please go listen or read them. Um, when you were talking about covert narcissism,
Mm.
as somebody, so you said this earlier when you were talking about your Cliff Notes journey of like living in a place and living in spaces and not necessarily knowing what the words for what was happening were.
Yeah.
I did not know. I grew up with, and I've said this on the podcast before, but I grew up in a home with a stepfather that was narcissistic, but I did not know what that was. He was alcoholic. I did not know that that's what, I knew the word, but I didn't know that that's how it manifests, right? And so it was really fascinating because I have lived so much of my life ever since learning that, being terrified of being a narcissist, because I was like, okay, so narcissism must mean I need people to be around me. Like it was such a bizarre way of being like, oh, okay, I don't know the words. And I also know I don't want to be like that. So I'm going to take everything under the sun, meaning narcissism. And what you're talking about here, I think, is the same thing we've dealt with gaslighting. Gaslighting is another word that like everybody uses for not agreeing with somebody or for miscommunication or, confusion. Can you talk a little bit about what covert narcissism is?
Sure, sure. So covert narcissism, you're not going to find it in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is more of a pop psychology term made all the more popular by the fact that Taylor Swift used it in her latest album. Um, Covert narcissism, though, describes a particular type of narcissistic behavior,
Mm.
which has its same roots in the wounding of the ego of the individual. Uh, but the manifestation looks a little bit different. With narcissistic personality disorder and the classic narcissist, we think big, brash, bold, like I am the best, everybody else is the worst, right? Like I'm the smartest, I'm the whatever, right? Very sort of grandiose manifestation of attention seeking to
Yeah.
soothe what is at its core a lack of esteem, regard, and quite frankly, confidence in oneself. Covert narcissism manifests a little bit differently. Well, a lot differently, I should say. It is still looking, the behaviors are still looking to soothe that intolerable feeling state of not feeling confident or assured or good enough. But the way one goes about it looks more like a very sort of passive manipulation of other to provide the reassurance to feed that, right? So instead of saying, I am the best, I am the strongest, I am the best in my generation, it's, I don't know if I'm a very good therapist. I mean, gosh, I mean, so many other people are better than I am, right? It's this pulling out from the other person what one longs to hear. Oh, you're fine, you're great, you're amazing, right? Feeding that ego wound, but in a way that looks quite different than being braggadocious or assertive, like the classic sort of typical narcissistic behavior.
So am I right in hearing, and maybe I'm not, so please say no, uh, that it sounds like you're kind of feeding to hear the thing that the classic narcissist is saying. So when you're like, I'm the best, you're like, I'm not that great. You tell me I am.
It's a manipulation, right? So if we want to sort of like widen that word between feeding, it's a manipulation of others to get the thing that you need. And certainly classic narcissists can do that as well. Their actions just look a little bit more overt. And so because of the subtlety of covert narcissism and that subtle social manipulation can be a lot harder to spot and yet can still leave one feeling, ugh, not very good after having come into contact or quite frankly, even a little bit crazy, like, why does this feel so bad? Like, why did that? Am I making this up? Am I crazy?
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of things about how you lead tends to fall into these patterns of dysfunctional interaction with others. And so I have so many clients where there is this feeling of, I mean, this happened, but like I can't trust it. And I'm like, all right, the biggest thing that I've learned to do is be like, how does it feel in your, if your body is walking away feeling like you're like sick to your stomach, that if there's something off here, that's something you can trust. You might not have the exact word for what it is, but if it's not right, how can we figure out how to create a
Oh,
less harmful experience?
absolutely. And when clients come to me with the experience of having been raised by mood or personality disordered parents, very often, we can't quite trust this yet, but what we can trust and what we have to, grow as a muscle is body wisdom and using the body as a bit of a compass, right? To understand what it is that person's actually feeling, what their intuition is trying to tell them. And when you've had that drilled out of you as a young child, as an adolescent, again, we really do have to retrain ourselves to listen to our body and use that as a bit of a signal as we move through the world. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Oh, and it's scary. Let me also honor that it's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a really empowering thing. And also the the part of reawakening your body can do things you don't expect. I say that as, a version of that happened this week that I was like, oh, I forgot how sensitive we can be in my body that I'm not expecting. My mind didn't know, but okay.
That is, that's such a nuanced and really important point, Nikki. I mean, like it can be scary to start to feel our bodies again because our bodies either can remember the memories that we tried to disassociate from. We always say the issues are in the tissues in trauma therapy. Our bodies will remember. And so when we start to increase that mind body connection, it can be uncomfortable, right? Now, the idea is not to leave somebody in a perpetual state of discomfort, but rather to help shepherd them through that, right? Metabolizing the traumas that might come up, helping them learn how to stay in a window of emotional regulation and tolerance. But I really appreciate you naming that. It's not all sunshine and daisies when we start to listen to our bodies. In fact, our bodies can be extraordinarily uncomfortable.
Yeah. And see, I'm somebody, there's a beauty and a curse in this. Like, I'm like, oh, it's uncomfortable. I can do uncomfortable. I've done uncomfortable. If there's magic in there somewhere, because I think there is so much power on the other, right? The amount of power that's creating that discomfort has so much power in it that, especially if you're somebody that has dissociated from the power of your body, once you start awakening, you're like, oh my God, look at all the things, kind of like that idea of, oh my God, look at all these doors that there are. I thought there were two. Once you start being at least welcomed back into the wisdom of your body, like, oh, there is so much in this well that I didn't get a chance to tap into.
Correct.
When doing EMDR work, I'm assuming, see, this is my assumption. Can you talk a little bit about how that's kind of awakening these parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily always have access to, and kind of what that experience looks like? Because I think those letters are out there, and I watched the like Prince Harry thing that he talked about doing and him, doing that. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how kind of transformative that can be for people? I know you were specifically, I was reading about how you were doing that with folks that were kind of first responders, essential workers, in the COVID space, of how supportive that could be.
Yeah. So let me just start with a little education. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's one of the two evidence-based gold standard treatments for anxiety and trauma treatment as endorsed by the World Health Organization, all five branches of the military. It really is the power tool in my trauma treatment toolbox. I'm an EMDR consultant in training, which is almost the highest level of training you can be. It's something I believe in with my whole heart because it's kind of like It was the missing ingredient that I didn't know I needed in doing this work because it can help move people through trauma quite quickly. So what's really important to talk about is like, well, what is this crazy thing that you do with eye movements? It sounds like magic or mumbo jumbo, right? It's like we can use eye movements, we can use alternating bilateral stimulation in our hands or auditory tones. The entire reason we use alternating eye movements or those tones or buzzers is to create activation of both hemispheres of the brain, because the brain, well, EMDR is premised on the adaptive information processing, basically philosophy, which says that our brain, um, when we can't properly metabolize traumas, right? Ideally, we are able to metabolize traumas and we move them back into long-term storage. They don't create distorted behaviors, beliefs, etc. However, when we are not able to do that, they get lodged maladaptively in our brain in what we call associated memory networks. And then we build more neural pathways on top of those maladaptive networks. So for instance, a 35-year-old woman who, is a very accomplished professional still feels a surge of panic to the point where she gets lightheaded when she sees an email from her boss saying, "Hey, can you come check in with me for a few minutes?" Right? That is not a response that's proportionate to reality. But what that email is doing is triggering something in that associated memory network that for her would most likely remind her of fear of an authority figure or something along those lines of lack of safety, right? So, utilizing EMDR, what we do is we, of course, we take a comprehensive history and understand what are the symptoms going on for this person. And then we identify memories and or triggers, right, that are happening in their current life or memories in their past that seem to be associated with those memory networks. And utilizing the bilateral lateral stimulation of EMDR, we begin to use layman's terms, clear out the maladaptive feelings, beliefs, and cognitions, and create more space for adaptive feelings, beliefs, and cognitions, moving that material back into long term storage where it belongs. So it's a very powerful modality. Only administered by mental health professionals for very good reason. It actually works with our brain's neural pathways, and it's pretty extraordinary.
I'm trying so hard not to like, I I feel like we take for granted this incredible machine we operate in, and the ability for us to actually be soothing and reprogramming it to go back to what it can do and heal itself. Um, and being able to use those tools is just like the cool. See, you were like, it sounded like mumbo jumbo. I'm like, I don't care what we call it. If it works and it's like you're able to support, like that's, I'm trying so hard not to, again, my body's freaking out. I just think it's such a wonderful tool to have. I love that you're like, it's the power tool in my toolkit,
Oh
that
yeah.
we have our bodies have this way of helping, right? And it's creating spaces where that can be held safely, that that this process can happen. But the fact that we have this opportunity and this option as human beings, that it's not like, oh well, this happens, just deal with it and push through. Oh, you get lightheaded, well, figure out how to push through that. It's like, no, no, that there are other options.
Oh my gosh, there are other options. And again, we forget. I think this is another thing where we were talking about how my daughter so quickly acclimated to wearing masks when she was a little toddler. Us as adults, we acclimate to a certain level of discomfort and pain, and then we start to normalize it. We're like, oh, well, of course, I um, feel like I need to have a couple drinks every single night because the anxiety in my body is so severe, right?
Yeah.
Or, of course, I, all I can expect is poor treatment from the men I date, right? We acclimate to the good and the bad and the hard. It's pretty remarkable how adaptable we are as humans for better or less, or for better or for worse. And what I always feel astounded by with EMDR is helping people remember that things can feel actually quite a bit easier than maybe they have felt in a long time.
I love that. It's so funny because one in my coaching work, EMDR, not not equivalent, but one of the biggest things that I'm working with people on is figuring out how to take the parts of our lives where we're operating in a car with our emergency brake up and putting our foot all the way down. I mean, like, why is my car not moving? To trying to figure out ways to be like, hey, oh, there's an emergency brake and we can push it and put, might not be the easiest thing to find where the button is to push it down, but there is a way for us to operate in flow. There is a way for us to not be constantly going against resistance. There is a way for us to find resonance. And I do think this is also part of the whole idea, as you're talking about, like, we're used to pain. We're also used to stress. We're used to this kind of destructive energy that we're like, oh, that's just life. That's how this is happening. So I will figure out a way around it, versus being like, actually, I think the problem might be the stress. The stress isn't just the outcome, it's actually perpetuating itself. And so us trying to soothe the stress with alcohol, or soothe the stress with pushing through, or that we can give ourselves permission to recognize that these things that we have historically seen as like really tough, or like you're really strong if you're going to do this like an adult, adults just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and keep going. It's like, actually, that's how we break down faster. And I think one of the things you mentioned before we hopped on here was just the Surgeon General talking about public health issues with regard to our mental health, with regard to one of the biggest things I talk to with my clients is like, the Surgeon General just came out with a whole report of the crisis of mental health and well-being in the workplace, that it is deterrent to so many aspects of our lives as humans, but our economy doing well, so many things that we just are like, oh, stress, that's just part of it. It's like, no, stress is actually probably one of the biggest hurdles of us living healthier, more kind of easeful lives.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Yeah, I really, really appreciate what Dr. Murthy has done to elevate the conversation and to help people understand, particularly anyone who has contact with an adolescent, the criticality of mental health right now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm speaking as a therapist and a parent. Um,
Yeah.
glad that we're taking this conversation really seriously.
Yeah. Same. Like, as I said, I would sit in rooms listening to this conversation all day if I could. Okay. So I feel like one of the things you actually brought up was about the repercussion of the last few years, which, as we're talking about gun violence as seemingly pervasive, prevalent everywhere, that mental health is something that we're like, oh, this is a problem everyone's having. How how do you as a therapist look at the current state of what the kind of outburst culture that we have, that we just kind of are normalizing these very significant responses to difficult things and saying, oh, thoughts and prayers type energy. Oh, let's kind of quiet that fire over there, rather than being like, everything's on fire right now if we keep fueling it the way we are. How have you kind of handled the fact that, again, we're normalizing outbursts as the way people actually react to things?
Uh, gosh, it's a really good question. I haven't quite thought about that. I generally see a couple of responses. I see a profound weariness when these news cycles happen, right? And I've experienced this myself. It's just like I can't even find it in me to get on social media and make a comment about it. I am so worn out and I'm so tired of it. And I'm so scared for my daughter's future. Right. So I see one response being a general weariness, not necessarily a shutting down to the information, but just a profound, a profound fatigue that's not the kind that can be solved by sleep. And then I do see, again, maybe for those who aren't feeling that same level of weariness, a level of activity, action, speaking out about it, um, texting their friends links to mom's demand action, etc. And that's fine. It's fine. The question, the issue is the burst and the shutting down, neither is really the answer. The answer is how do we collectively continuously sustain a level of action and dialogue here so that we actually move away from these cycles. I don't know what that answer is because I also know, too, alongside all of these horrible things happening in the world, unprocessed trauma, the grind of daily life, sickness, illness, disease, cancer, breakups, we're all pretty taxed. And so I don't know what the answer is to sustainably engage. It's a question that I live alongside my clients.
I'm like, it would be amazing if you were like, oh, I have it. I just, no one's really asked me it before. I got it. It's like my back pocket.
Totally,
Magic, magic answer.
totally. 10 steps to solving the housing crisis in America. Let me
Yeah,
just tell you.
yeah, I got it. Why has no one asked me this?
I
It's
know.
as you were talking about the EMDR element of it, though, it's really funny that you're talking about like that email creating the lightheadedness, the kind of bursts of those elements that are happening in the individual experience. And as our collective, that we seem to be having these kind of bursts of dysfunction. And how we, I mean, there's a part of me, it's like, can we as our society collectively sit in a session, and have that same version of clearing out and reprogramming to a point of like, I don't know, my baseline is like shared humanity and collective connection. But there is a part of this that feels very parallel as you're talking about it.
Well, and I think what we're talking about to a certain extent is a kind of vicarious trauma. And this is
Mm,
see particularly in first responders or firemen, policemen, etc. Those who did not necessarily experience the violence themselves, but were in close proximity to witnessing it. To a certain degree, we're all dealing with a collective vicarious trauma. Now we see more graphic images, the faces of the children that are shot. God forbid we see worse than that, right? We are all dealing, I think, with a certain level of vicarious trauma. And certainly I have applied EMDR to that with many of my clients who name those as targets that they want to resolve. And that can be very helpful.
yeah. Oh, see, I'm like, all right, how can we get the US government to be like, hey, let's have a whole bunch of incredibly trained humans that do this, and let's make this something that we can be able to use in our toolkit.
Oh,
Um,
well, I will say there is a phenomenal clinician. Her name is Laurel Parnell. She's an EMDR clinician. She has a book called Tapping In. I believe I don't want to get that wrong. Um, I believe it's Laurel Parnell Tapping In, and it really is kind of about harnessing self-administered bilateral stimulation as a personal growth tool and to help resolve distress, etc. She's a really wonderful contributor in the EMDR space. So I highly recommend that book to anyone who is curious about, well, how can I, if I can't afford to work with an EMDR therapist, or there's a wait list that's like 8 months long to work with an EMDR therapist, how can I get some of these healing tools in my own life?
I love that. We'll make sure that that's in the show notes for sure. Uh, yeah, I feel like I'm like, oh, we have some answers. Let's, how do we get them? One of the things that I also would love for you to talk about, you talked a little bit about this. Oh, we have like 2 seconds. Okay. Um, is oh, maybe not. Never mind. I'm gonna end because I want to make sure that you're not rushing.
Oh,
Okay.
no, no, no. Ask the question.
You
I can,
sure? Okay.
yeah, totally.
So I know one of the things that you started talking about kind of that black sheep energy and that like, all right, I haven't been accepted in this space, whether it be as a child or where we are, wherever you are in your life, and how formative it is to kind of be building a new foundation in your 30s and your 40s.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you're in your 30s and 40s now, and you have been in this experience of stress being put on your sense of self, your relationships with others, how you want to spend your time moving forward, how do you kind of, I would love to hear your take on this like 30s, 40s energy of rebuilding foundations. I think it's a really powerful thought process, especially since historically it was seen as like 40s was like middle age, and it was like, oh, this is a midlife crisis, and it's like, well, I don't know if that's what it is, but like how have you kind of framed that experience that I think many, I'm raising my hand, many of us have had a version of like, oh wait, this is how I want to kind of adjust to where and how I am in this world moving forward.
Definitely. Well, I would love to first recommend there were two blogs I wrote. It was a two-part series, two essays at the top of this year about why adulting can suddenly feel so hard in the 30s and 40s. And I think the level of responsibilities, both relational, financial, and professional, that most of us start to feel in our 30s and 40s will bring to our attention any developmental gaps that might have been there all along from the way we were raised.
Yeah.
We weren't aware of until the relational and financial and professional pressures started to accumulate. So I'd love to send you those and have your readers take a peek at them because they might feel really resonant. But the answer, whether you're trying to build a foundation in your 30s and 40s and you come from a fairly normative psychological background or one in which there was childhood trauma that's unresolved, the answer is the same. We take a look at whatever developmental tasks were unmet, that were missed or compromised while growing up, right? any developmental tasks that are sort of erroneously formed that are leading to results we don't want to have in our present life. And we begin either filling in those gaps, learning for the first time, relearning what it is that those developmental tasks should look like, healthy assertive communication, self-care skills, finding and forming healthy functional relationships, listening to our bodies as a source of wisdom, etc. So we get clear on the results that we currently have and the patterns that we have that have created those results. And we get clearer, sometimes with professional help, about what results we want, how things would look different, and commensurately what developmental tasks now need to be addressed in order to get us there to that next
I think
level.
we're in a place, right, where when you're in your 30s and 40s, those things that are showing that they don't work are big things. Like they're not like, oh, I stubbed my toe. They're like, oh, I'm going through a divorce. Oh, I no longer can speak to my parents or my siblings. Oh, this career is like not right for me. Oh, my body's no longer functioning. They're not the little things anymore.
You're not the little things anymore. And the stakes often feel quite a bit higher too, right? If we continue to ignore and neglect our bodies, the 40s are usually when we start to accumulate things on our medical charts, right?
Yeah.
And so the stakes can often feel higher. And here's the thing, and I do want to leave everyone with a bit of hope. It's never too late.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
never too late if you're in your 30s, your 40s, et cetera. Most people will think like, oh, that would have been great to do in my teens or 20s. It's like, yes, true, but still far better to do it in your 30s and 40s than in your 70s and 80s.
Yes. And if my mom is listening, I always say this to her because she's like, well, I'm like, no, your 60s, there's still, at least for me, if I could put a hand, I got a whole bunch more years with you. So like, why
Yeah.
not? Let's do this. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, you're talking about 30s and 40s, but I'm double that, still very accessible for you to be doing this work, to be able to hold yourself with the love and the care that you for sure deserve. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining today.
Oh,
I feel
Nick,
like we could talk for 700 more hours. Maybe we will.
I know. Oh my gosh, it's a joy. You led us down such a rich conversational path. So it was just as nourishing to me as hopefully it was helpful to you and your listeners.
Oh, yeah, I feel like they're nodding their heads. Yes, I am so grateful. And we will make sure that people have the ability to connect with you. What is the best way for them to do that? If you have like one way that you would tell them to do that now?
Sure. Come find me online, www.anniewright.com. You can read my essays there. You can take my signature quiz that will help you begin to see whether or not you do come from a relational trauma history. You can learn more about my clinical work in the world, my therapy center. It's all there, just on
Yeah.
that one.
And you can get to know Annie a little more. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? Come on now.
Love, and I read every single email people send me. So I would genuinely love to, receive comments and emails.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm like sending you the biggest hug across the country right now. And I hope I get to see you soon.
Oh my God, I would love that so much.
Seriously. All right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
So what do you think? I thought that conversation was wonderful, but I'm a little biased. We could have talked for so much longer. I'm sure there are other things, other questions that you have. So if you do have questions, Annie mentioned, reach out to her for sure. But if you have questions that you'd like for us to cover on the podcast, maybe have more of a conversation around how trauma is impacting our lives, how these incredible modalities and therapy give us this opportunity for repair, for growth, for connection and reconnection to ourselves. I would absolutely love to hear from you. As I've mentioned like 200 times in this episode, this is the stuff I nerd out hard about. So if this is something you want us to dive more into, we definitely want to hear from you. You can go to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast, and there's a button there called join the conversation. Let us know. You're finding us, I'm sure, through some amazing podcast platform. On there, there's a link to our website there. And if you are connected with us on social media, feel free to drop us a DM or connect with us with any questions you have. So in this episode, there were so many great resources. So also at the nikkyinnocent.com/podcast page, you will see there is going to be show notes for Annie in this episode with all of the incredible reports and resources in that book that she talked about that we all should be reading. So I encourage you to, if you're not able to do this right now because you're driving or on the move or something, to kind of bookmark that in your brain, to go back and take a look at that page, to just get all these incredible resources and hopefully take her quiz. So I hope that you enjoyed this. If you're here right now, I think you enjoyed it. And I will catch you on the next episode, my friends.